Hi, Bill. I am going to introduce you, our host of this tribute. William Walsh is the author of 7 books. His new collection of poetry, Fly Fishing in Times Square, recently won the Editor's Prize at Cervena Barva Press. He is the director of the undergraduate and graduate writing programs at Reinhardt University in Wauwatosa, Georgia. His work has appeared in Rattle, the Kenyon Review, the Valparaiso Poetry Review, Shenandoah, Literary Matters, 5 Points, the AWP Chronicle, and elsewhere. His interview with Eavan Boland was recently printed in the Georgia Review. And you are watching this. You can read or download it by going to our website and at writersatlarge.com. If you would like to learn more about the Georgia Review, you can also read about them or subscribe at that page. With no further ado, I would like to bring us to go. You're on, Bill.
All right. Well, Thea, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Eavan Boland's work. First, I want to thank the Georgia Review for allowing us to link up with the review that was online. It was originally published in the journal in print, and then they put it online, and so you can go out there and read it. It's one of the finest magazines in the country, and I recommend it for everybody who's interested in the most current literary thinking in the country. Subscribe to the Georgia Review. It's really a good magazine. And also, I want to thank our other 2 presenters tonight. Dr. Donna Little. She is my cohort at Reinhardt University. Our offices are next door to each other, and we are sort of partners in crime all the time. And she did her thesis on Boland's work, and I knew she would love to do this. And the other presenter is Madeline Gray Lara. She was a student at Reinhardt. She graduated this past spring, and she was one of my best students in Irish literature and culture, and I knew she would very much enjoy discussing Boland's work because I taught it as a feminist doctrine of the entire class, and of course we use Boland's work to highlight that. I was asked back in November to introduce Eavan Boland at the University of Georgia's poetry series reading, and so I did, and I'm going to read from my introduction because it's what I want to say anyways. And so I had the opportunity to drive her around and then have dinner with her that evening, and it was just one of the most remarkable times of my literary life. And Donna went with me, and she got to meet one of her literary heroes, so that was also nice. So I'm going to start by reading my introduction, or parts of it, and then I'm going to read 3 poems by Boland, one that we just recently published in the James Dickey Review, and then 2 from her book, A Woman Without a Country. They're very good poems. So without further ado, I'm going to read from my introduction. For a number of years, I have taught a course in Irish literature and culture at my home institution, Reinhardt University. And among the standard author readings I petition of my students, it includes William Butler Yeats, Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Patrick Kavanagh, George Bernard Shaw, Seamus Heaney, Paul Muldoon, Edna O'Brien, Paula Meehan, Anne Enright, and Mary Davenport O'Neill, and many others. Just depends on which semester and when I'm teaching it. I varied up a little bit. But the backdrop of Irish writers, along with the harsh Irish conditions of a story such as Angela's Ashes, the social mores and repressive climate for women in O'Brien's fictional Country Girls, or the destructive nature of overall oppression and how the Irish demanded independence from Britain They are the counterweight to the liberation of spirit as we ease into contemporary poetry. And this is how I present the class. The young women I taught, or I have taught over the years, are especially drawn to Eavan Boland and who for years has steadily fashioned a career as one of the best Irish poets, but even more so as one of the best poets writing in the English language. Boland's themes of social violence, oppression, Irish history, and the unburied dead of history, as she called it, the significance of myth, and the compulsion to confront reality resonate with 21st century American students in unexpected ways. Boland writes about her experiences of being a woman in the suburbs of the modern world, a locale which, as Vincent Hanley has stated, is, quote, a setting not associated traditionally with poetic inspiration, close quote. Boland acknowledges in her essay, Object Lessons, how she realized that the Irish nation as an existing construct was not available to me. Thus, she made a personal map of the world with her own traditions and ideas of where she placed herself in the world. And even though, on the one hand, she says, she knew that as a poet, she could not easily do without the idea of a nation. She has expanded her vision into a world that inspires beyond the Irish borders. In Object Lesson, Boland admits her reliance on all that Ireland has to offer a poet, yet she built a life beyond what was probably expected of her as a young girl. Quote, I could not, as a woman, accept the nation formulated for me by Irish poetry and its traditions, close quote. What you will find is a strong woman refusing to accept the rules for being a woman in a country oppressed by a foreign government whose oppression filtered down from each level of hierarchy to the young women of Ireland. And she demanded that they demanded that women behave and adhere to what was the norm. Boland would never have anything of that. Eavan Boland was born in Dublin in 1944 and lived for several years in London till about the age of 14, before returning to attend Holy Child School in Kilkenny. While a student at Trinity College in 1962, she published a little book called 23 Poems. In 1969, she married Kevin Casey, a novelist. They have two daughters. In addition to having been a member of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, over the years, she has taught at Trinity College in Dublin, the National Maternity Hospital, the School of Irish Studies in Dublin, University College, and Bowdoin College. She was the Bella Mabry and Eloise Mabry Knapp Professor in Humanities, the Melvin and Bill Lane Professor of English, and the Director of Creative Writing, the Creative Writing Program at Stanford University, where she taught from 1966 until recently. In 2017, Boland was presented with the Bob Hughes Lifetime Achievement Award at the Ford Gaius Energy Irish Book Awards. Her body of work comprises more than 25 volumes, including new collected poems, new selected poems, and a collection of essays titled A Journey with Two Maps, Becoming a Woman Poet, which Publishers Weekly described as Boland offering encouragement to women poets of the future. Her vivid imagery will beguile many. As I have guided my students through Boland's work, usually we read from A Woman Without a Country or Outside History, her selected poems, or sometimes An Origin Like Water, which are her collected poems. The women feel empowered by her life and poetry, knowing she escaped conditions many others could not, and many others did not. Having never met Boland except through her poems, the students admire the personal strength needed to carve out a life, whether in Dublin or at Stanford University, a life that has roots in all the oppression and hardships we explored with other Irish writers, as well as an Irish history wrought by British oppression. When studying Boland's poetry, the students rightfully begin to discuss their own struggles, and remembering Yeats, I quoted from him, "I, being poor, have only my dreams." These students were better able to resist the oppressive forces in their lives too. To understand the strengths needed to overcome provincial societal norms, to rally against antiquated ideas and histories that demand women conduct themselves in antithetical ways, or in ways that are antithetical for a free-thinking person. After encountering Boland, many students engage the world in a more powerful voice. As Gerald Smythe has written in the Irish Times, Boland pioneered a poetic language for those living unseen lives in the new territories of Dublin suburbia. Smythe fails to acknowledge, however, that those territories expand beyond just Dublin and the Irish coast, and like radio waves venturing out into the world to touch one person and then another. Anybody who is listening. When I think of Eavan Boland, I am reminded of numerous beautiful poems and individual lines, such as in the poem Shame, where she states, "There are so many names for misery," or in lesson 4, where Boland has come to accept that the story of Irish history is not her story. And then in one of her most famous poems, Anna Liffey, where love will heal what language fails to know and needs to say. But in her early work, from a poem called From the Painting Back from Market by Chardin, she says, "I think of what great art removes, hazard and death, the future and the past, this woman's secret history and her loves." In Boland's work, there is an invitation from the poet to enter a secret history of Ireland, including what the world has forced upon that country and its people, and how they have developed unbendable strength over centuries of time. There is also the secret history of Boland's life made public through the mirror she calls Menses, where she says, "The moon's looking glass." She reflects through these mirrors what she wishes the world to see in whatever ways individuals interpret her poems. So the interview came about, hang on, I'm going to get a drink of water quickly. The interview came about, and we started it in December 2018, and we finished in April of 2019, and we did it by email. She did not have time to meet for an extended period of time, but in pockets of time in her life, she could respond to questions. I was hopeful to fly to California to meet her in Stanford, but even more hopeful that I wanted to go to Dublin and spend about a week just in Dublin and then go over and interview her several times throughout the week. But that was never going to happen because she was just so busy. But she did take the time to respond individually to my questions. Oftentimes, I would ask a question that she did not like the way I phrased it, and being a strong woman as she is, she fired back, "Rephrase this question or rewrite this question." And so, not one to argue, I did. But it turned out to be a really good interview. She was such a wonderful, pleasant woman, fiercely strong. I mean, when you sit there and have dinner with her and talk to her about issues, she is of such strong opinion that you just are mesmerized, that you want to listen to what she has to say. I felt the same when I met Joseph Brodsky for 3 days many, many years ago. Such a powerful voice and force that you are compelled to listen. So what I want to do is I have 3 poems that I want to read. And the first poem I'm going to read was a poem that she gave to us at the James Dickey Review. And I'm going to hold it up. It is also for sale. You can buy it. You can subscribe to it. It comes out once a year. And we publish some of the finest writing in the country. And she sent me a poem, and it's called 3 Crafts. And I'm going to read it. 3 crafts. The spindle was hammered into the stock of the wheel. The legs were turned and smoothed and propped up the spinning motion, which made a small, odd music. More a whining, really, enough to cover up the sound a tree makes on a summer night. The frame that was woven under the curric was wood and canvas. It was made out of willow or something hazel and was ready for the waters of the western seaboard, a world away from how those branches once dragged at a quiet river in Lucan. On wild nights when trees are getting ready to become memories of themselves, no one will remember. I remember stumbling into this art when I was young. How often I wrote late at night, hoping as window latches broke loose and the wind rose and undid all the leaves, that what I wrote might be capable of learning from that ocean cadence. Its fall, its rise, its fall. And I like this poem, and I was so pleased when she said it because it really is her acknowledging this beginning of becoming a poet and understanding that she was becoming a poet. But most of the time, writers don't realize until years later that they've done what they set out to do or how it actually came about. When did you first start writing poetry, and were you going to continue on? And I think she recognized that idea of when she first started writing. This next poem is called Amethyst Beads, and it's from her book, A Woman Without a Country, which is just a wonderful collection. And so I'll read this. Amethyst Beads. And when I take them out of the cherrywood box, these beads are the color of dog violets in shadow. Then, at the well of the throat, where tears start, they darken. Now, I wear my neck an old stress of crystals, an impression of earthly housekeeping, a mysterious brightness made underground where there is no sun, only stories of a strayed child and her mother bargaining with a sullen king, promising and arguing what she can keep, what she can let him have. Shadows and the seasoned violets start up in the shadows and the seasoned violets start up in are part of the settlement. Stolen from such a place, these beads cannot be anything but wise to the healing arts of compromise, of survival. And when I wear them, it is almost as if my skin was taking into itself a medicine of light, something like the old Sibyls, rosemary, say, or tansy, or chamomile, which they keep to cool fever, which they once used to soothe a child, tossing from side to side, beads of sweat, catching and holding a gleam of the vigil lamp. A child crying out in her sleep, wait for me, don't leave me here. Who will remember this? Who will remember this? Very good poem. Very good poem. I love that poem. Although I messed up a little bit in the reading, but so the last poem I'm going to read, and this is the last one in the book, and she and I discussed becoming Anne Bradstreet, and it's a wonderful poem, and I like it because it really harks back to the beginning of American poetry, as well as Boland becoming a poet and understanding that Bradstreet became a poet, and there were things that one must go through. But there's something about this poem that also, to me, being that it's the last poem in the book, leads one to think about the future of each person's poetry, Boland's poetry, and in poetry in the world in a general sense. Becoming Anne Bradstreet. It happens again as soon as I take down her book and open it. I turn the page. My skies rise higher and hang younger stars. The ship's rail freezes. Mare Hibericum leads to Anne Bradstreet's coast. A blackbird leaves her pine trees and lands in my spruce trees. I open my door on a Dublin street. Her child, her words are staring up at me. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth I thee house I find. We say home truths because her words can be at home anywhere, at the source, at the end, and whenever. The book lies open, and I am again an Irish poet watching an English woman become an American poet. Uh, Three poems that I very much like. We like again, like I said, we were lucky enough to be able to publish um, one of her poems in the James Dickey Review. Boland writes about her experiences of being a woman in the suburbs of the modern world, a locale which, as Vincent Hanley has said, is, quote, a setting not associated traditionally with poetic inspiration, close quote. Boland acknowledges in her essay, Object Lesson, how she realized that the Irish nation as an existing construct was not available to me. So this was not available to her. Thus, I mean, for her times, things have changed, of course. Thus, she made a personalized map of the world with her own traditions and ideas of where she placed herself in the world. And even though, quote, on the one hand, I knew that as a poet I could not easily do without the idea of a nation, close quote, she has expanded her vision into a world that inspires beyond the Irish borders. In Object Lesson, Boland admits her reliance on all that Ireland has to offer a poet, yet she built a life beyond what was probably expected of her as a young girl. And she quotes, I quote her, I could not, as a woman, accept the nation formulated for me by Irish poetry and its traditions, close quote. What you will find is a strong woman refusing to accept the rules for being a woman in a country oppressed by a foreign government whose oppression filtered down from each level of hierarchy to the young women of Ireland, demanding that they behave and adhere to what was the norm. Boland would have nothing of this. Eavan Boland was born in Dublin in 1944 and for several years lived in London, I think from age 7 to about 14. Before returning, and she attended Holy Child School of Killiney. While a student at Trinity College in 1962, she published 23 poems, a little book. In 1969, she married Kevin Casey, a novelist. They have 2 daughters. In addition to having been a member of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, over the years she taught at Trinity College in Dublin, National Maternity Hospital, and the School of Irish Studies in Dublin, the University of the College, and in Bowdoin College. She was the Bella Mabry and Eloise Mabry Knapp Professor in Humanities, the Melvin and Bill Lane Professor of English, and the director of the Creative Writing Program at Stanford University, where she taught since 1996. And in 2017, Boland was presented with the Bob Hughes Lifetime Achievement Award at the Bord Gaius Energy Irish Book Awards. Her body of work comprises more than 25 volumes, including collected poems, new selected poems, a collection of essays called A Journey with 2 Maps, Becoming a Woman Poet, which Publishers Weekly described as Boland offering encouragement to women poets of the future. Her vivid imagery beguile many. Now, when I teach this class, I like to guide my students through Boland's work, and typically with A Woman Without a Country, Outside History, her selected poems, or An Origin Like Water, which is her collected poems. And the young women feel empowered by her life and her poetry, knowing she escaped conditions many others could not. Having never met Boland except through her poems, the students admire the personal strength needed to carve out a life, whether in Dublin or at Stanford University. A life that has roots in all the oppression and hardships we explored with other Irish writers, as well as an Irish history wrought by British oppression. When studying Boland's poetry, the students rightfully begin to discuss their own struggles and remembering Yeats's quote, "I, being poor, have only my dreams." They were better able to resist the oppressive forces in their lives and then understand the strength needed to overcome provincial societal norms, to rally against antiquated ideas and histories that demand women conduct themselves in ways antithetical for a free-thinking person. As Gerald Smythe has written in the Irish Times about Boland, he says, quote, "She pioneered a poetic language for those living unseen lives in new territories of Dublin suburbia," close quote. Smith fails to acknowledge that those territories expand beyond Dublin and the Irish coast, but like radio waves, venture out to the world to touch, one by one, anyone listening. And I make this note because that's how Boland has touched my students, and specifically the young women in class who gravitate towards her ability to be a strong woman and a strong figure in their scholastic lives. When I think of Eavan Boland, I am reminded of numerous beautiful poems and individual lines, such as in the poem Shame, where there are, quote, "so many names for misery," close quote. And in lesson 4, Boland states, where she comes to accept that the story of Irish history is not her story. And in fact, she goes on in her entire life to create a story of her life beyond the Irish borders. And Anna Liffey states, or in the poem Anna Liffey, it states, "Love will heal what language fails to know and needs to say." And in her earlier work, from the poem From the Painting Back from Market by Chardin, it says, "I think of what great art removes, hazard and death, the future and the past, this woman's secret history and her loves." In Boland's work, there is an invitation from the poet to enter a secret history of Ireland, including what the world has forced upon that country and its people, and how they have developed unbendable strengths over centuries of time. There is also the secret history of Boland's life, made public through the mirror she calls menses, where she says, quote, "the moon's looking glass," which is very representational of her life. She reflects through these mirrors what she wishes the world to see in whatever ways individuals interpret her poetry. And I really found that this was true with my students. So that was my introduction. And so let me just briefly talk about the interview I did with her. It's been just about a year, well, a little more than a year, about a year and a month since we completed it. But it started in December of 2018, and we finished it in April 2019, and we did it by email. And I actually wanted to either fly out to San Francisco and go down to Stanford University and interview her in person, if that was possible, or fly to Dublin and then interview her. I mean, who wouldn't want to fly to Dublin to do an interview? But she was so incredibly busy that she just couldn't take the time to sit for a long period and do a comprehensive interview. But she had pockets of time when she could respond to my email questions. And so that's how we did the interview. And I'd only done one other interview that way. And this was back in 2005. And Thea, you know who that was? That was Jack. And Jack's interview was the most powerful interview, in that he was most honest in that interview than I've ever seen him, or in any interview or conversations I've had with him, because it allowed him the ability, and I think the same thing with Eavan Boland, to have a sense of anonymity by not being face to face. And as a result, that anonymity led to a great amount of honesty. And I think that comes out in Boland's interview. So she had pockets of time when she could respond to my questions. Now, not every question went smoothly. There are questions I asked, and she just disagreed with my entire premise and wrote back and said, fix this question, rewrite the question. I don't think this is the way you want the question asked. Well, it pretty much was, but I went ahead and reframed the question and I sent it back to her, and then she responded. And having never met her in person, I did not know really how strong of a person she was, her personality. And at dinner and then driving her around, when you have a conversation with Eavan Boland, she is a powerful force, and she has her opinions, and she's just that strong that she wants things her certain way. And so I accommodated that in the interview. And so over the course of about 5 months, we framed the interview, and which was published in the Georgia Review, and get a subscription to it if you haven't. So that's the part I want to talk about. And then I've got 3 poems I want to read before I turn it over to whoever's next. Since I had a relationship with Eavan through email, and then having talked to her at different times, I felt comfortable asking her for a poem for the James Dickey Review. And she sent me one. And that was it. She's too busy for anything else to do with it. So when I sent proofs of the poem, she just was too busy to take time to respond to it. But the poem was the way she wanted it. And so we published it, and it's a good poem. And I was very, very pleased that she gave us a poem. So I'm going to read that poem first. And this is in the most recent issue of the James Dickey Review, which anybody listening to this podcast can get a subscription. We never deny that. And so this poem she gave us is called 3 Crafts. And so I'll read it. 3 Crafts. The spindle was hammered into the stock of the wheel. The legs were turned and smoothed and propped up the spinning motion, which made a small, odd music. More a whirling, really, enough to cover up the sound a tree makes on a summer night. The frame that was woven under the curric was wood and canvas. It was made out of willow or something, sometimes hazel, and was ready for the waters of the western seaboard, a world away from how those same branches once dragged at the quiet river in Lucan. On wild nights when trees are getting ready to become memories of themselves, no one will remember. I remember stumbling into this art when I was young. How often I wrote late at night, hoping as the wind latches broke loose and the wind rose and undid all the leaves, that what I wrote might be capable of learning from that ocean cadence, its fall, its rise and fall. And I love that poem because she and I did discuss the idea of her early life and coming to writing. And so this really is an idea of when she was young and she found the art of poetry, which for poets, when it happens, I don't think you're cognizant of the fact that you're falling into it until you look back on it years later and you go, oh yes, that was a key moment. That was a seminal moment in my life when I started writing or became interested in writing poetry. So the other 2 poems I'm going to read are from the book, A Woman Without a Country, which both of these poems are poems I've read to my students at different times over the years, and we've often discussed these. And the first one is called Amethyst Beads. Amethyst beads. And when I take them out of the cherrywood box, these beads are the color of dog violets in shadow. Then at the well of the throat, where tears start, they darken. Now I wear at my neck an old stress of crystal, an impression of earthly housekeeping, a mysterious brightness made underground where there is no sun, only stories of a strayed child and her mother bargaining with a sullen king, promising and arguing what she can keep, what she can let him have. Shadows and the seasoned violets start up are in part of the settlement. Stolen from such a place, these beads cannot be anything but wise to the healing arts of compromise and survival. And when I wear them, it is almost as if my skin was taking into itself a medicine of light, something like the old simples, rosemary, say, or tansy, or chamomile, which they kept to cool fever, which they once used to soothe the child tossing from side to side, beads of sweat catching and holding a gleam from the vigil lamp, a child crying out in her sleep, wait for me, don't leave me here. Who will remember this? Who will remember this? And I love those two last lines. It reminds me of Frost a little bit. And I think perhaps that question, who will remember this, is a defining question in Boland's work. Who will remember this? And hence why we're here. We are remembering her work, her life, and I think in time, poets and other people will read her work and remember it. But it's that idea of invisibility once you have died. You know, the idea is after 50 years after you die, there won't be anyone here to remember you. And as poets, we try to stave off that idea that we will be forgotten, or not just poets, but artists also. And so now the last poem is actually the last poem in the book, called Becoming Anne Bradstreet. And she and I actually talked about this poem. Becoming Anne Bradstreet. It happens again as soon as I take down her book and open it. I turn the page. The skies rise higher and hang younger stars. The ship's rail freezes. Mar Hybericum leads to Anne Bradstreet's coast. A blackbird leaves her pine trees and lands in my spruce trees. I open my door on a Dublin street. Her child, her words are staring up at me. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth, I the house I find. We say home truths because her words can be at home anywhere. At the source, at the end, and whenever, the book lies open, and I am again an Irish poet, watching an English woman become an American poet. And I love that poem, and it's about the progression of life, not really just as a poet and an artist, but life itself. It's a metaphor for that. And we become different things at different periods of our life. And so she is an Irish woman watching Anne Bradstreet become an American poet. Those are the three poems I wanted to read. So Thea, I'll turn it back over to you. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything.
Well, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce whoever's next, because this is until your guests, Donna and Madeline, have completed their tribute. Then I will take over and invite our two audience members to say something.
All right. Well, I'm going to introduce Madeline first, and then Donna will finish everything. Madeline Gray, well, it's Laura now. She got married not too long ago, and she is a graduate of Reinhardt University, and she majored in history, and she did some of the most remarkable things with historical food recipes. And I went to a presentation she gave one time with Dr. Ann Good, and they made a couple different types of cookies from very, very old historical recipes. And but Madeline was one of my favorite students. I only had her for one class, but each class she came prepared and just brilliant with her observations for everything we read and what she contributed to the class. And so I invited her here to talk about Boland's work. So Madeline, you have the floor.
Great. Can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, great. My mic wasn't working earlier, so I just wanted to make sure. And my cat's joining too, intermittently, I suppose. Well, thank you, Professor Walsh, for inviting me back to literature, as it were. I'm honored to have asked to be here and to offer my thoughts on this wonderful poet. And I hope I do her at least a little bit of justice in just my, my notes here. So I've been out of the liberal arts studies for a little while now. So jumping back in to poetry has been so refreshing, especially when reading the works of someone like Eavan Boland. As Professor Walsh mentioned, she's so astounding when putting into words what women and Irish women experience, not just in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but even now in the 21st century, when so much has changed for women. There are just still so many poignant things that she has to say. As I was milling through her poetry again, I just couldn't help but be struck by the small details in life that she just makes so grand. She takes small things that one would normally pass by without a second thought, and she just breathes life into them. For example, I watched an interview of her for The Writing Life, which was in 2008, and it was a wonderful interview. The interviewer asked really wonderful questions. And Boland mentioned that her mother-in-law once told her a story of how they threw out all these oil lamps in Western Ireland when they all got electric light. And Boland saw that as this terrible tragedy of throwing out the past for the sake of modernity. And in just that example, you can see how she just has this uncanny ability to see depth in moments that we would just see at face value. We would see, great, we're moving forward. She's saying, oh no, we're getting rid of the past. So needless to say, it's just been a pleasure stepping back from all that's going on in the world right now and take a look at her works. Unlike Professors Walsh and Little, I'm not a professional in the world of literature. So when reapproaching these works, I simply had the context of my own life. So when I was in Professor Walsh's class, I had the context of the readings and the lectures surrounding my intake of these works, but now I'm separated from that context. I'm married, I work, I do things a little bit differently in my life, and Boland's work has hit me in a far more personal way than it did when I was a student. And perhaps it's a bit vain of me to project myself into her life, but I just couldn't help by seeing the relationships that hit her and her life and seeing those in my own. A couple of these relationships are being her relationship with the past, specifically, of course, the Irish past, and also the relationship that she had with her mother and motherhood. And it is evident in the span of her poetry that these are the relationships that were driving forces in her life. So in the interview with The Writing Life that I mentioned, Boland says that being an Irish poet was the honor of her life and that her mother was her hero. These are strong phrases that show just how impactful these two relationships were in her life. So I'm just going to dive a little bit into those. So I first want to discuss her remarkable and insightful relationship with the past. As Professor Walsh mentioned, I have a degree in history. So Boland's emphasis on the Irish past was moving to me, to say the least. In my somewhat limited experience with poetry, I have found that poets tend to focus on their own life and making something very tangible that has happened to them and sharing that moment. But Boland, however, not only writes with amazing clarity about her own moments, but also about moments in the Irish past. And I think she would argue that these two stories are part of the same narrative. She mentioned in the aforementioned interview with The Writing Life that she wanted to tell stories of those whose experience is traditionally ignored. So she does. She tells the story of the poor and the starving and of this oppressed. It's not just women, it's the people in the famine, it's people who just have experienced oppression in life. And she doesn't just say what happened in history. No, she makes a point in the interview with The Writing Life to distinguish history from the past. History is what happened, and its narrative is not malleable. It is composed of facts. The past, however, is what was and is still experienced. The past, according to Boland, is where life takes place, and it is within this space that she writes her wonderful poetry. I absolutely love this distinction that she made, because while my major was in history, my minor was in literature. And this is because I also feel this distinction and this struggle between history, which is facts, and past, which is almost an interpretation of those moments. And Boland had a gift of understanding this difference, and that the past is important to one's identity in the present, an identity that she and many other Irish men and women have struggled with for centuries. In her poetry, Boland seems to cling to the Ireland of the past, fearing that if she did not immortalize it in her poetry, that it would be lost. She felt that the stories of the oppressed were not forgotten and could still be told with resounding relevance. This is seen in one of her most famous poems, Quarantine, which I read that one first just because of everything going on, in which she tells the brief story of a couple who dies as a result of the famine in 1847, and the acts of final love that are seen in those type of moments. I just love this poem because at the very end, she even calls out love poems, saying like, forget all those other love poems. This man dying, warming his wife with his dying breath, that is love. And that's where we see in this tragic moment. When we see in history, the potato famine, it's such a defining moment in Irish history, and it is very well known. But the final moments of the poor and the starving is a story that is far less told. We know how many people died. We know why there was a famine. We know what happened as a result to Ireland as a nation. But she goes beyond that and chooses to tell the story of an individual. She also does this in a poem called The Emigrant Irish, which was inspired by her mother-in-law's recounting of the discarding of the oil lamps. Boland seems to be writing as if from grief should the Irish past be set aside. And I greatly admire her passion for understanding and sharing the Irish past, and I can absolutely see why she's become an icon for this nation. The facts are in books, the stories of many still lay dormant, waiting to be told, and Boland has sought to tell them. And I think that's something that people who may not directly feel the potato famine in their lives, they're not starving and that sort of thing, but they feel that effect on their family and how that's created the life that they have now. I think a lot of Irish Americans can feel that because for many, the reason that their family is in America is because of the famine. To move on, while Boland's love for Ireland and her ability to tell the story of its people is the most famous theme within her poetry, her relationship with her mother is one that particularly struck me as well. As a young woman with a strong, positive relationship with my own mother, I can deeply relate to the identity that is built from a mother to her daughter. And I also can relate to the complexity that comes with becoming your own woman and the changes that take place in that relationship. Boland's mother was an artist. She was a painter. She created imagery in the physical sense, and Boland has manifested that by creating imagery in the literary sense. In the interview with The Writing Life, Boland talks about the profound effect her mother had on her life. She notes that her mother's profession as a painter taught her the ability to look critically at her work and to have the courage to make changes. You're not a fool to admit that you've messed up, and it's also important to look at life from a different perspective. She, of course, perfectly puts this into words in her poem, The Final Discipline. In this poem, Boland describes her mother working at her easel and the routine of finishing her work as she looks at the painting in a mirror over her shoulder. When looking at the artwork over her shoulder, she is teaching Boland to look critically at her work and to have the ability to step back and, like I said, look at something from a completely separate point of view. And I love her language in this poetry because I could feel her relishing in that memory of her mother and how the lessons from that moment have taught her and stayed with her throughout her life. I could see how this process taught her to step back, and this is a skill that has assisted her very much, I think, in her work as a poet. She talked a little bit about the process of creating poetry in that interview, and I'm not great at poetry, so I always, when I'm reading poetry, it just sounds like something someone is impassioned and they sit down and they write and they come up with this beautiful language, but she really described a really methodical, drawn out process of creating something as good as what she creates. And I dread the day that I lose my mother, and I regret that I'll never be able to immortalize her in the way that Boland has done for her mother. Boland writes honestly, and when her mother died, she did not hide from the grief or write about it in an overly metaphorical way that makes it almost intangible to those of us who don't think that way. She confronts her profound loss head on with the words in her poem, "And Soul," as she travels on the wettest day of the year to pay, quote, "the last tribute of a daughter," end quote. The word tribute is really strong there. It's acknowledging that something has come and has gone, and you're paying it a respect. She again addresses this grief in her poem, Amber, with lines like, "It never mattered that there was once a vast grieving," when referring to the amber that her mother gifted her that once fell from the tree long ago. Again, you see the relevance of the past and the present and how they can exist in the same moment and have a really strong meaning. And the last theme I would like to note in Boland's poetry is the one regarding her own journey with motherhood. Boland captures the hardship of being a mother herself in her poem Pomegranate. In this poem, Boland goes back and forth between the legend of Ceres and Persephone and the relationship with her own daughter. This is my favorite poem of hers because of the striking imagery between a legend and reality. She moves the narrative fluidly through the two stories, bringing them together with a single imagery, the pomegranate. She mentions a can of Coke, teen magazines, ethereal things like flowers and white beams that fit into the legend of Persephone and Ceres. And then there is the pomegranate, which fits into both stories, the legend and reality. In this poem, Boland notes that this legend is the only one that she could ever love, which is a bold phrase with someone coming from the land of myths and legends. For her to love one that is not Irish so strongly it was a little surprising to me to hear her attach that importance to it. The fact that this legend, the legend of a daughter lost in hell, which is the first line of the poem, is the only one that she can love, shows just how complex this relationship is and how it affects her life. She yearns to warn her daughter of the hardships that await her as a woman, an Irish woman, but cannot bring herself to do it. In this, we see her mother's influence again. Boland was equipped with the most important of life lessons by her mother, and she wants to do the same for her daughter, but knows she must hold back because she can't save her from what's to come. And in order for her to be strong, she has to take them on herself. So these are just my thoughts of a young female non-literary professional looking back at these works years later and taking them in a far more personal way. And like I said at the beginning, I just admire her ability to take these small moments of life and see them with the grandeur that they deserve. There were so many of her poems I wish I could have mentioned and really dissected, but this is what I had. And Boland did what many of us try and fail to do. She gave a voice to those who needed it and who lacked it, and brought the past into the present with ease. She was a voice to those in Ireland who needed one, and she has become a part of their past that I don't think will be soon forgotten. And she has also given the woman of the world who struggled to put into words the tumultuous journey of womanhood into something that is consumable. And for that, I'm very grateful to have not only dove into her work years ago, but also now. A lot's changed since I was a student at Reinhardt. And I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to read this all again and share my thoughts with you all. So thank you.
Well, very good, Madeline. And thank you. So I'm going to introduce Donna Little now. Donna and I are colleagues at Reinhardt University, and I'm going to get the year wrong, but I think Donna, I know you've been there more than 20 years, but are you in your 25th year? I think.
22nd, I think.
22nd,
22nd or 23rd.
Yeah, I knew it was the 22nd. So, but Donna teaches English and creative writing at Reinhardt University, and she's the reason I'm there. Many years ago, about 5 years ago, we met and we just forged a friendship through about writing and literature and ideas, and we get along and we make each other laugh. And she's a wonderful writer herself and a scholar. She has a PhD from University of Virginia, right? And she's got a master's degree and an MFA, and her master's thesis was on Boland's work, which is one of the reasons I thought she would love to do this. Donna is right now in the middle of an epic journey in her life where she is researching and writing about Pine Log Mountain in the Etowah Valley, up in the northwestern portion of Georgia. And she's done this tremendous amount of research, which is incredibly interesting, going back centuries as to what happened on this mountain. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Donna Little, who is one of my good friends and colleagues at the university. I'm very pleased to have her here with us today. Donna, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I was kind of heartbroken when I found out that Boland had passed away, because I definitely see her as a literary mother. So it's personal to me. I did write my critical thesis for my MFA on Boland, and it was published as an article in Contemporary Women's Literature. So I studied Boland quite a bit for a while, but it wasn't just an academic or even literary interest. Part of the reason I chose her was because I also am actually just a fourth generation American, and all of my great grandparents came over on boats from Ireland in the early 20th century. And Boland was about the same age as my mother. But I felt that she articulated so much of the identity and experiences of the women in my family. And so that was part of what drew me to her. She felt like family to me. And when I met her, I was so lucky that I did get to meet her this past fall when she was at the University of Georgia. And it did immediately feel like I was just sitting down with one of my aunts or grandmothers. And so it was just lovely to meet her, and sad to find out that she had passed. So I'm glad to be part of this and be able to celebrate her. So she feels like family, but also she feels like a literary mother. And I see Boland as a kind of in the next generation from Plath and Sexton. That's the lineage that I see her, because I see her as a feminist poet, and one who was trying to develop a language of poetry unique to women writers. And I think that was one of her preoccupations. So the master's thesis, the critical thesis that I wrote that turned into the article, was really about her writing the female body, and me exploring the different ways in which she wrote the female body. The first poems by Boland that I ever encountered were the ones that are most frequently anthologized, which are Anorexic and Menses. I think those are the ones that you most often see in literary anthologies. And obviously those are of the body. But the deeper I delved into her work, I saw so many different ways in which she wrote the female body. And I think that one of her main quests was to have the female body appear in poetry, not as an object, but as a subject. And she wrote about that in her memoir, Object Lessons, how she had always felt as if women in poetry are the object of the gaze, as feminists will talk about it, but never the subject, never the speaker, and that she was trying to change that. She was trying to change woman, and especially the female body, from object to subject. So as I studied her, I saw that I felt like she had 4 different types of poems in which she writes of the female body. The first one that I identified was the female body in historical trauma, especially the Irish famine, coming over on the boats, all of those experiences of the oppressed men and women, but especially women of Ireland. Then she writes quite a few ekphrastic poems. And, part of the reason for that may be because, as Madeline mentioned, her mother was an artist, a painter. But interestingly, she wrote a lot of ekphrastic poems in which there were male painters painting women. And it was interesting because it was a kind of variation on ekphrastic, because she would describe the painting, but she would also describe the man who was painting the painting. And so then she would sort of turn him into the object. And the way that she described men painting women, there was a sort of violence in the act, because the women were being turned into, in Boland's view, the women were being turned into objects as they were being painted. And one of the things I noticed is that in so many of Boland's poems about the female body, there are these images of wounding and scarring. So it's interesting that in one way she was trying to empower women and give women a more powerful role as subject, but yet it seemed like there were still all these wounds and scars that appear in the poems. Like it wasn't just going to be an easy transition from object to subject. The woman's body, even as it becomes subject, is still carrying these wounds and scars. So when she writes about men painting women, it almost seems like an act of violence. Then she has poems, which I call the self-sculpture poems. And these are poems, a lot of them are about plastic surgery, but I would also put anorexic in this category. These are poems where women are actually sort of doing violence to themselves through seeking plastic surgery, or through dieting and exercise, or obsessing on makeup and appearance. That it's almost like they are trying to tame their own body in the way that their bodies had been tamed by men in earlier generations. And then the last type of poem about the female body that I identified was what I call the woman as artist poems. And those are the most positive of the types of poems about the female body that she wrote. And those are the poems where the woman, there's no act of self-violence or no act of violence from a male of any kind, but rather it's just pure creation, where the female body is actually productive and enjoying the act of creation. So I thought I would just touch on a few examples of each of those types of poems. With the literal poems of historical violence, she wrote a lot about her own grandmother. And in several poems, her grandmother lived in Ireland, obviously, and died of a fever at age 31 after having had several children. And so for Boland, she becomes a kind of emblem of the Irish women whose bodies bore the brunt of famine, starvation, poverty, childbearing, etc. And she has one poem where she talks about the woman's body itself becoming a quote famine road. And so it's as if the body manifests all of these experiences of that her grandmother went through. She also writes a lot about working class women, a lot of seamstresses and laundresses, and to me, again, that resonated very personally, because if you're of Irish heritage, you had some women ancestors who were probably laundresses and seamstresses and working class women. And that was one of the things that I just really appreciated about Boland and her work, is that she really did celebrate working class women, and not in a condescending way, but in a way that was showing that they too were artists, that they too were making things, they were sewing things, and that they were sort of these heroines of history who have been left outside history. I think is one of the poems where she talks about that you know, history has not honored these women, and yet she never fails to honor them. And it was, I think she had a very matriarchal sensibility. And these women that came before her were, you know, whether they were literally her own grandmother or just other Irish working class women, they were the matriarchs. And she is bringing them into history, whereas before that they had stood outside of history. With the ekphrastic poems, a good example of that is Degas' Laundresses, which is, you know, she starts out describing the painting, which is of these women washing clothes, but then she describes the man who is painting the women. And I'll just quote a few lines from that part. She writes, "See, he takes his ease, staking his easel so, slowly sharpening charcoal." And so she actually turns the charcoal that he's drawing with into a kind of sharpened object, and a means of violence. So it's kind of hyperbolic, but I think she's really trying to I think there's some underlying anger there, even at the way that women have been reified in art and in poetry, that she's getting at with that. She has an image, which is in the title of the article I wrote about this, and it's the cruel needle, and it's a kind of double entendre, crewel, like cruel. It's like a kind of a crocheting that women used to do, and then needle obviously can have a bunch of meanings. So I mean, it would be like the sticks that people crochet with, or whatever it is that women made lace with. I'm not exactly sure what you called that. And so it's creativity, but also as a double entendre with cruel, crewel, also the echo of cruel, cruel. And so in a lot of the images that she presents, they like the charcoal that I was just referring to, it almost becomes like a knife. So there are these knives and these needles that women's bodies are sort of figuratively being mutilated by. And I think I pick up on a note almost of like a satire or even self-satire, because I don't think she was saying that, there's these other women who care so much about their appearance that they're willing to go under the knife. I think she was recognizing it in herself. I don't know if she ever had plastic surgery or not, but the anorexic poem also, that so many of us women who claim to be these liberated feminists, we still do these things to our bodies to kind of discipline them to be what our culture demands that they be. And so I think she was almost possibly calling out her own feeling of hypocrisy, or just noting that you know, we as women, we're really not over it. That there may not be anybody else who is doing violence to us, although that still happens too. But we do violence to ourselves. It's like we've internalized it. And so one of my favorite poems like that is the one that is called A Ballad of Beauty and Time. And it's a woman who goes shopping for a face, basically shopping for a new mouth and a new nose. And the plastic surgeon is described almost in sort of serial killer terms, like he has these body parts hanging in a room that you can purchase. if you haven't read that poem, it's a powerful poem that really makes you think about what are we as women doing to ourselves. And then the last category that I talk about is the woman as artist poems. And those to me are the most positive because the woman is not mutilating herself or being mutilated by anybody else. And a lot of these poems, interestingly, also have sewing imagery, but it's not the woman herself who's being sewn on, but rather she is sewing, she is making something through sewing. And so it actually connects back to those seamstresses and laundresses of Irish history, those working class women. And there are several poems in which she talks about her making quilts. And this, obviously, there's a metaphor in that with making quilts and making poetry. And, you know, there is a cutting involved and fragmentation and bits and pieces. But instead of it being a destructive, taking things apart process, it becomes, you know, taking the scraps and making something beautiful, sewing them together to make something beautiful. There's one called, or a couple of them, there's one called Patchwork or the Poet's Craft, and there's another called The Unlived Life. She also has other female characters in these poems, like there's an Appalachian woman in one poem who's teaching her how to make a quilt, some of the patterns. So again, it's this embracing of the working class woman and not acting as if a poet is some kind of ivory tower, but rather that the poet is a seamstress, just like the seamstresses of the past. And I think that ultimately, even though I wrote a lot about Boland's use of syntax and, you know, all these kind of technical poetic techniques that she does, but I think ultimately what I most valued about Boland is, and it sort of halfway came true last fall when I met her at UGA, is I feel like she could come into my grandmother's kitchen and we could all sit down and have a cup of tea in my grandmother's kitchen and, you know, eat some scones or something, and chat about, you know, children and clothing and, you know, shoes or whatever. It would click. It did click when I met her. In fact, I remember as we said goodnight to her when Bill and I were dropping her off, and she hugged me and kissed me, and it just felt like the hug or kiss of a mother or a grandmother. I don't know, it was kind of like a final blessing that she gave me that time that I met her. It just was very meaningful to me. So I'm really glad I got the chance to come be here today and talk about Boland with you guys.
I'm unmuting you. It's I had to mute you a couple people because it kept switching over. Yeah, and you should be unmuted now. Did you?
I am, yeah.
I'm good.
Yes, there you are, Bill. It was it kept every time someone would breathe a certain way, and you know, it would sort of take away from you, and then also your bandwidth was going up and down. It kept getting little notices saying that your bandwidth was low. Now it's normal. Now it's low. And you froze a couple of times, and then you blacked out and came back. Yeah, we missed a little small part of what you were saying, but this is, you know, interesting to learn what are the strengths and weaknesses of the system.
Yeah.
You know. So, Bill, did you have, I was going to ask, we've got a participant, Lila. I don't know if she wants to say anything. I think she's self-muted. Oh, there she, I unmuted her. So, hi, Lila. And I guess it'd be nice to know where everybody is. Bill's here in Atlanta, correct?
I'm in Atlanta, Sandy Springs.
And where are you, Madeline? Oh, I have to unmute you.
I'm a little farther up in 400. I'm in Forsyth County.
Okay. And Donna, you're also in the Atlanta area?
Yes, even a little further north than that. But yes, about an hour north of Atlanta.
And Lila, are you in Austin? Lila? She's unmuted, but I don't know if she's can hear me. Anyway, and I'm in Alaska, so.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize you were in Alaska. Oh my goodness.
I'm in Fairbanks, Alaska. So I started the Writer's Garret with my late husband, Jack Myers, poet, back in, oh gosh, about 27 years ago, 28 years ago. And then he passed away, be 11 years this year. And so I kept the Writer's Garret going for a while by myself. And then I met somebody who moved to Alaska. And so I came up here, and some other people are running the Writer's Garret now, and different scope and different approach, but that's fine. That's what happens when you pass something on. And so some of the things I was working on trying to do through the Writer's Garret, we are now trying to do through Writers at Large. So I spent about 10 years doing a bunch of studies on where literature was going and how meetings were going to go and publishing, and worked with a lot of experts, and they decided to do something differently. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go ahead and take the 10 years or 11 years of learning and apply it to something else. So that's what we're trying to do. But anyway, I want to thank you so much. It was very interesting hearing what everybody had to say about Eavan, and I've been calling her Evan for years, incorrectly, and I'm gonna throw Jack under a bus. I'm pretty sure I heard him say Evan, but he was from Boston, so anything, huh? Bill?
Well, no, I'll say in your defense and Jack's defense, for a couple months before we actually met her, we were trying to find out how do you actually pronounce her name. So
Okay.
When I picked her up in the car, and we were talking, and I said to her, I have to ask you a question. And she knew what I was going to ask. And everybody asks me that, and she said it was Eavan.
Oh.
And so, and so we said, all right, well, there we go. And so, but she gets it all the time, and she says it doesn't bother her. She gets people calling her Evan and all, just different nuances of her name, but she was actually quite funny about it. So
Very interesting. Well, Lila left, so I don't think she had anything she wanted to say. So I think she just wanted to hear, but she listened through the whole thing. Heather, our webmaster, listened through, went 2/3 of it, to see how things were going. I am going to stop the recording here for a minute to say. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming on a Memorial Day and joining us for our first beta, Zoom, and also to pay tribute to the great poet Eavan Boland. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, listeners. So anybody want to have any concluding remarks?
Well, I think one of the nice things about not just her poetry, but also her life, is that she brings people together, and that's what she's done right here. She brought us together, and this is the beginning of your project, Writers at Large, and which it'll grow, it'll get bigger. And I like the idea that people can come back later and hear these recordings of our ideas and our thoughts. And that's really, I think, one of the things she did is she brought people together with her poetry. So,
wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's been a real pleasure. And I have to confess that I heard Jack talk about her a lot, and I really didn't. I listened, but he was always introducing me to new poets, and so it just kept being pushed back to the back burner. And I feel like I've got a cycle now, and I find that extremely gratifying. I also, the person I'm with here in Alaska is also Irish American. So we went to Ireland 3 years ago, and it was really wonderful. His name is McCoy, and we found out that where we were in Central Ireland, it's very common for us in the U.S., but it's not common at all in Ireland. There are almost no McCoys. So they said, oh, that's from the north, and Northern Ireland more than Central. So it's really interesting, how you get sort of a skewed understanding based on what the immigration patterns, and I loved the fact that you all talked about her awareness of perspectives on immigration and how that, there's Ireland, there's male Ireland, there's female Ireland, and then there's Irish Ireland, and immigrant Ireland, and it's they all have slightly different nuances to them, and I like that you all touched on how her poetry explored that, and I loved the idea of the mythic Ireland versus the real Ireland. That was really interesting as well. So thank you all. And I'm looking forward to future endeavors and involvement. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. I
All
appreciate
right,
it very
sure.
much.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.